Hello, everybody. Sorry about the fumbling around, but welcome to our July Fika. It's been quite a while since the last one we ran in March, and we're continuing the theme of inclusive landscapes here again, talking about SDG 10, reduced inequalities. This is a really important aspect of social sustainability for us at Vestra, as we've identified it as one of the 3 cornerstones of our 2050 business strategy. And today we're joined by 3 experts on the subject of neurodivergence in outdoor spaces for a conversation about this relatively new area of research and practice. So Dr. Katie Gaudion will describe her expertise in this area through the RCA and Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design. Welcome, Katie. Jane and Tom of DSDHA will describe their research, both architects and delivery around projects, including their approach to the recently completed Exchange Square. It's a really topical subject, and I know you're going to leave enlightened today about this important aspect of inclusion in our society. So welcome, Katie, Jane and Tom. I'm Romy. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Commercial Director at Vestra here in the UK. And I should just mention we're recording this webinar for catch-up purposes, which I hope is okay with everybody. None of you are on screen, obviously. And just a little bit of background, people who've joined us before will know that these Fikas are all around the Sustainable Development Goals. And this one, SDG 10.2, is designed to reduce inequalities both within and among countries. These persist across the world, and we may think they're lesser here in the UK and less affected than in many other countries, but actually inequality around this subject threatens both long-term social and economic development and destroys people's sense of fulfillment and self-worth. We can't achieve sustainable development and make the planet better for everyone if anyone at all is excluded from the chance of a better life. And equality can and should be achieved, but political, economic and social policies need to be universal and pay particular attention to the needs of disadvantaged or marginalised people, such as those who identify as neurodivergent. And I'm sure you'll have lots of questions on this, so please do add them to the Q&A tab and join in the conversation. And we've got quite a lot to get through today, so we're going to hand over to Katie to introduce the subject and describe her work, and that will follow with Jane and Tom's presentation. So I'll stop sharing, Katie, and then hopefully you can get in yourself.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Hi everyone, and thanks again, Romy, for inviting me here today. I'm just going to share my presentation. There we go. Okay, so so my name's Katie Gaudion, and I'm a senior research at the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design. And over the past 16 years, I've been really fortunate to work with lots of different people who are autistic and or neurodivergent. And an important focus of my work has been to explore creative ways to meaningfully involve autistic people, particularly those with additional learning disabilities and limited speech, into the design process. The Helen Hamlyn Centre, just to give you a bit of background, is a globally recognised centre of excellence with a 30-year history of inclusive design thinking and creative leadership to improve people's lives. We're situated in part of the Royal College of Art, and this is our new, it's called the Rulsing, don't know if I've pronounced that right, Research and Innovation Building that was opened this year, and it's based in Battersea in London. And we're also the largest, longest running centre for design research at London's Royal College of Art. For those of you who don't know what inclusive design is, it's about involving people with a full range of experiences, perspectives, and abilities into the design process to explore ways to improve their own lives. What it isn't is projects that don't involve people and design ideas that are based on a designer's assumptions of what they think people need and want. Historically, particularly within the field of universal design, there's been a particular focus on improving a person's physical access needs. But what about a person's emotional, sensory needs and experiences? Since the turn of the century at the Helen Hamlyn Centre, we've increasingly sought to expand its focus to purposely include design projects that involve neurodivergent people whose needs and challenges may not be so obvious or visible as others. So what do we mean by neurodivergence and neurodivergence diversity and divergent, sorry. So I thought I would use these descriptions, which were developed by a neurodivergent artist called John Adams, who developed a forum called Flow Observatorium, which supports neurodivergent artists. He talks about neurodiversity as the diversity of all human minds. He talks about neurodivergent as a person who is not neurotypical, including but not restricted to autism, Tourette's, dyslexia, dyspraxia, PTSD, bipolar. And he talks about neurodivergence as the state of being neurodivergent. So I hope that's helpful for today. And I'm going to share with you a selection of some neurodivergent projects we've led on at the centre, which are all illustrated on this slide, which cover a wide range of subjects and contexts. So, for example, in 2003, we worked with dyslexic people on the project READ to develop a typeface for people with dyslexia. 2010 was the start of a 6-year partnership with the charity Autism at Kingwood, where we collaborated with autistic adults to explore ways to improve different aspects of their home environment. And this collaboration also contributed towards my PhD, which was called A Designer's Approach, exploring how autistic adults with additional learning disabilities experience their home environment. In 2013, we worked with Bupa and collaborated with people with dementia and their carers to design better wayfinding within care homes. 2016, we collaborated with the British Standards Institution to gather insights to support the development of new design guidelines for the built environment that considered the needs of neurodivergent people. And what's brilliant is that the new Design for Mind PAS publicly available specification is currently being developed, which is really fantastic. In 2018, during the project Game Change, we worked with psychologists, people living with psychosis, and NHS staff to explore the design of virtual reality environments and scenarios that can be guided by a virtual coach. The most recent project we're working on right now is in collaboration with a creative arts charity called Heart and Soul and the NHS in Greenwich and Oxley to explore ways to make health and social care services better for people with learning disabilities and autistic people. And that's a 2-year project and we're just halfway through. And you can email me if you'd like some more information about that. But today we're going to focus very briefly, haven't got that much time, on a project I worked on that was about designing a shared garden space. And this essentially was a garden for 9 autistic adults who actually lived in 2 separate homes that were connected, but they were going to be sharing the garden. What I think what's really important about this project, but actually about all the projects I've worked on, is not necessarily the final outcome, but actually how we were able to involve the participants, in this case, autistic adults, to actually be active participants in the research and to really understand what their needs, wants, and desires might be in this context, a garden space. So we did engage with lots of different co-design methods, but for this presentation, I'll just focus on a couple as we're limited on time. Firstly, a lot of sort of existing research in autism is often framed around what's called the triad of impairment. So where an autistic person is generically characterized around impairment in social interaction, communication, and imagination. So in response to this, and the fact I've already met an autistic person that neatly slots into this characterization, and it's very deficit focused, like rarely do we talk about people in terms of what they can't do and their deficits. I developed this framework called the Triad of Strengths. And as a designer, I felt it would be really interesting to really understand what a person's interests were, what their sensory preferences were, and how they like to engage with the environment. And it could just be one of these things that could really help with a design project. So now I'm going to take you just through a couple of tools that I used, which helped me to understand a person's interests and sensory preferences, in which an autistic people in this garden project were able to engage and express their preferences. So initially, we started by using what's readily available, and that's some sensory profiling checklists, which are often used by occupational therapists. But it was it was very quick to we were very quick to realize that they were very uninclusive, and in fact, the autistic people we work with wouldn't really be able to engage and express their preferences in such a wordy tick box, dense text type of form. And also their support staff, who, particularly if their first language wasn't English, found it very difficult to engage with this questionnaire. So what we did is we took this questionnaire, but we also thought about, as designers, what would be interesting for us to really understand, what sensory experiences in the home and the garden would be useful for us to know about in order to then design around a person's likes, but also being mindful of a person's dislikes. The cards, I think there were 72 of them, they were color coded into 6 different sensory modalities. So sight, sound, taste, hearing, proprioception, and vestibulation. I hope that's all of them. And on the back of each card was a sort of a very simple design suggestion as to how you might want to adapt that space according to that person's sensory preference. These cards meant that, particularly with the people I was working with, a person could actually express what they liked or disliked through gesture, eye contact, and even blinking. And so this is kind of how it works. Very simple activity. And what it means is there's a mood board of what a person likes and dislikes, which, we were working with sort of 9 of these. And it meant that we could really think about what things we may want to avoid putting in the garden, but actually what things would work really well in the garden, and trying to curate and negotiate different people's interests, likes and dislikes, which, was a challenge, but these cards really helped. So things like, we knew that music was quite popular for a lot of people, so sound was something to consider. Being in small enclosed spaces was a popular preference. So we knew maybe a den-like structure towards the back of the garden could be good, together with water, etc. These cards were really interesting also because I think it provoked a lot of conversation, and there was lots of learnings that came from it. So, for example, one support worker explained how thanks to this activity, she now realized that the person she supported, called Tom, he often would go to the beach but never want to come out of the water. And she now sort of connected this potentially to the fact he dislikes sand, which she found out through this activity. So they could be really useful in different ways. As well as these cards, we also made some very simple booklets to really capture and understand what a person's interests were. And this activity was supported by a support worker or family member, in which a person could write or draw the things that they were interested in. We then visualized a person's interests in the form of a tree using leaves, and also categorize the interests into things like people, vehicles, spinning. So this person really likes vehicles, likes to watch wheels spin, and likes to collect key rings. And so once you gather everyone's interest, you can again start sort of understanding any connections between any interests, and start to think about what sort of activities we could encourage into the garden space. So if spinning actually was quite popular, what sort of things can we bring into the garden that spin or can encourage someone to spin? The same with organizing. This is the illustration of the completed garden. I think what was really important about this garden was that the two, as you immediately enter the garden, that space, I think you can see at the top, the sort of the flat lawn, was very, as much as possible, low, what's the word? It was very neat and not too much sensory stimulation. So someone who can get quite hyperstimulated, they wouldn't be confronted by too much. But as you gradually go towards the back of the garden, it gets a bit more exploratory and sensory. So there was a real transition as you went through to the garden. And the garden was divided into different sort of zones or spaces as such, sort of escape, exercise, sensory, social space, transition, occupation, and wilderness. So there would be a space if someone doesn't want to be around people that they could go to a more quieter space, or if someone does like lots of sensory stimulation, they could go towards the back of the garden. So there was lots of choice about where people might want to go. These are just some images of the garden, so I'll just take you through those. There we go. And then I just wanted to end really with this slide, which I think is so interesting. And this is a drawing by an amazing artist and also someone that supports autistic adults called Ian Wilson. And he documented his experience with some of the people he supported. And so to the left is a storyboard of his experience with a guy, and they're walking along and the person he supported got very anxious. And Ian connected this to a puddle on the floor and the fact that this person could see roofs and clouds, and that could be quite scary if you took that literally in terms of walking into a puddle of roofs and clouds. And then the next one is a storyboard about Ian going to a park one day, and the person being very anxious and frightened by the shadows cast from the trees. And so Ian perceived this as maybe the person who's supporting saw these as either holes in the ground or big black obstacles. And I think these are really interesting insights, because I think it just goes to show that you can never really make any assumptions about how a person might experience outdoor space, and to really be mindful of everything really, and to get to know a person, to understand what sorts of things they like or may dislike. And it might be things you may never even imagine or realize until you get to know the person. So I just wanted to end with that, because I think these are really insightful drawings and insights. And that's it. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. And that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That was wonderful and beautiful graphics. I think that was so clear. Thanks very much.
Great.
Some of us, which you might not recognise, but some of us amongst the presenters are quite nervous about doing all of this kind of thing. So it's a relief to have got to this point. But yes, thank you again. I'm going to save any questions until Jane and Tom have also spoken, if that's okay. But I've seen yours, Stephen. Thank you for putting that in the Q&A. So if you're ready, Jane, Tom, do you want to share and crack on with your presentation?
Yes, I'll share screen now. Yeah, that was really great. And I think there's lots of correlation with things that we've sort of maybe like informally observed in our own work. So yeah, hopefully those the questions will be applicable to both. I'm just going to try it and hide this. So hopefully everyone can see the screen. Okay, so yes, thank you thanks for inviting us, and thank you to everyone for coming to be part of this conversation. Jane and I are from an architecture practice called DSDHA. We're based in Vauxhall in London. I say we're an architecture practice. We've over recent years sort of expanded what we do to also include urban and landscape design, and also research projects, specifically about the city, how people use the city, and increasingly ways to create a more kind of equitable and inclusive city. The idea, or the kind of the term neurodiversity, is something that we've only really started kind of talking about within perhaps the last 12 months. But I think we've gone through a process of reflecting on previous projects that we've done. We've identified certain characteristics of those projects that actually do speak quite well to the subject, or that do kind of target some of the things that our subsequent research has highlighted as being beneficial for creating more inclusive environments. So just a couple of projects that I'm going to start with before we talk about our practice research. This is a project in the City of London in Broadgate Circle, where about 5 years ago we were appointed to just do a really super modest project. Our work here identified through talking to lots of people that this environment was somewhere that lots of people found kind of overstimulating, anxiety-inducing. Actually, one of the main comments that came out was it was very male-dominated, and there was kind of vertical drinking culture. It had become known as the bear pit. So our kind of really fairly modest intervention just included seating, planting, but seating that offered a variety of different ways to occupy it or to sit on it, rather than kind of prescriptive kind of forms of public seating. And actually, the kind of the success of this project was that it really divided up that space. It stopped the kind of congregation of large groups of people, and it actually allowed people to sit in kind of smaller, more intimate environments, disconnected from larger crowds of people, which I think this idea of escape or kind of more intimate space was something that that Katie also observed. Similarly, for the last 10 years, we've been working with the Friends of Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, which is our local park to our studio, which when we first came to Vauxhall looked a bit like this. It was again a park that was described as anxiety-inducing. It encouraged behaviours that people found intimidating, and it was recorded as some of the people would avoid at certain times of day. Through a kind of really slow 10-year phased strategy, making improvements as and when money became available, we've sort of shifted the character of this park to be one that is seen as more safe, more inclusive of kind of a greater variety of people, and one that is genuinely used over much longer periods of the day. And on reflection, we think that perhaps part of this is to do with a methodology that we apply to a lot of our projects in the office, which is this analysis of movement and views. So particularly in this case, visual permeability through the park. One of the things the park suffered from was being a park that was created through some clearance after the Second World War, which meant that a lot of stuff was mounded up in the middle of the park as this big kind of dense kind of obstruction. So part of the work was actually just to erode that and create clear sightlines through, and therefore kind of multiple routes or multiple opportunities for taking a different direction, which then increased the sense of opportunity or safety. I think as well as the urban or the landscape projects we've done, we also, as a practice, have a history in designing schools for special needs schools. This is Pond Meadow School in Guildford, which was designed for severely physically disabled students, but perhaps more specifically this school in Sutton, the Link Primary School. This has a specialism, a speech, language and communication specialism. So a high proportion of the students have autism. And it was through this project that we really started to learn how some of those kind of more macro or urban techniques of sightlines, views, kind of contact with nature play out also in more kind of internal environments. So we learned a lot about what kind of overstimulates certain people, what creates a calming environment, and those have then subsequently been fed back into larger scale urban projects. And we do this because all of our work is towards this pursuit of spatial justice, which we see as the kind of perhaps the impact that the built environment has on exacerbating the climate crisis, the cost of living crisis, social injustices and health inequality. So we're trying through our research and through our work to address those injustices.
So yeah, over I guess a decade now, we've embarked on different pieces of research, sort of addressing this from different angles. So we have a piece of research on mobility titled Sharing the Beautiful Everyday Journey, a piece specifically on spatial justice that was with the London School of Architecture, and most recently an accessibility guidelines that was done in collaboration with David Bonnet Associates and 10 collaborating London boroughs of the Cross River Partnership. So we'll go into some of these slightly in more detail, but we'll try to speed through as well. So in terms of the mobility research, something that was really critical as a finding as part of this research is trying to demystify user groups of public space. So in this case, for cycling, it was trying to break down the stereotype of who the cyclist is, that, you know, not all cyclists are white men clad in lycras traveling on cycle superhighways. So acknowledging the full spectrum, or the fullest spectrum of different cyclists going at different speeds with different levels of confidence, etc., which is easily also transferable to neurodiversity, that we are all on the neurodiversity spectrum. Some of us are more typical, some of us are more divergent, and that how by acknowledging the sheer spectrum of users, we make the designing and the analytical process more inclusive. As part of the spatial justice piece that we did with students from the London School of Architecture, we tried to address it from the other end, which is coming from the designer side, acknowledging first our positionality and our lived experiences as designers, and how that affects the level of empathy that we bring to the communities that we design for, which leads on to this more recent piece of research for the Cross River Partnership, talking about key issues affecting highways and footways today. And a lot of it is actually, you know, talking about co-design practices that Katie sort of alluded to, that the process is as much important as the actual design. And with it, the consultation of different user groups that's often neglected in experimental traffic schemes, for example. So one of the key issues was designing for neurodiversity. It sits within a wider board of key issues that we've identified in collaboration with the local authorities. And in doing this, we also found how this issue is intersectional to other key issues affecting highways and footways today, such as alternative crossings. So talking about, say, colorful crossings is really confusing for neurodivergent people, as you can imagine from that sort of comic strip that Katie showed. Shared use, where the delineation of spaces is unclear, and how they can be designed so that people from all spectrums of neurodiversity can engage with it confidently. And also something as basic as pavement clutter, how the clarity of our public spaces has a huge implication of how different people navigate the space. And that's particularly prescient with the sort of emerging modes of transport, such as e-scooters. So out of this research, we also engaged with real sites. Over the course of COVID, we looked around our neighborhood in Vauxhall and sort of identified how experimental traffic schemes can be very well intended, but they also create difficult urban situations for both abled bodies and those that struggle otherwise in sort of these ad hoc implemented schemes, and how that the different ways of engaging with the spaces, say like, you know, cyclists going on the pavement, generates actually maybe even worse implications for neurodivergent or people with disabilities. More recently, we are embarking on a public realm and landscape design strategy for the British Library. This is, of course, a public institution and offers one of the biggest open spaces in the King's Cross and Pancras area. And similarly to the earlier project that Tom talked about at Vauxhall, we approach each site with a larger analysis of its accessibility and desire routes through the sites in the much wider strategic area, understanding as well how, in the context of such a big campus, what the microclimates are, and what the more nuanced desire routes are throughout the scheme. And in doing so, we sort of generate constraints and parameters to create different zones, again, breaking up big open spaces into smaller spaces where users can either tailor them to their own needs or find different programmatic uses that are off their need at any particular time. In doing so as well, we tried to dissolve this sort of institutional boundary and also the sort of the outdoor and the inner threshold of the institution. Again, trying to make this entire piece more inclusive as one public space that's permeable inside and out. And as you can see here, some of the sort of little pockets of space generates a bigger possibility for people to feel either more calm or more confident or in control, depending on what their sensitivities are. And as part of the scheme, we're also developing a co-design piece with Global Generation so that we work with the local community from Somerstown to design specifically different zones for their stewardship in years to come. Yeah, and maybe going to something more extreme in terms of footfall, we have Wembley. We designed a gateway that connects the station to the Wembley Stadium, and as those of you familiar with event days, you can imagine the sheer amount of traffic and footfall that passes by this, well, quite actually narrow passage. So having to negotiate between those sheer volumes of traffic, but also everyday residential and local amenity needs. So sort of designing to the extremities of each site and creating enough flexibility that it can be used in every day as a space for respite, but also a legible circulation space on event days. So I'll head over back to Tom.
Yeah, I'll wrap up really quickly so we can move on to questions. But just to conclude, I wanted to show you a very recent project of ours. So this is Exchange Square in the City of London. It sits over the tracks to Liverpool Street Station, so you can see it suspended here. So as you can imagine, it is an environment that is incredibly stimulating. The noise of trains, the noise of announcements, all those thousands of people from the offices. It's the third busiest station in the country. So it's a space that struggles to be inclusive of everyone. But that was the ambition that we set for ourselves, to create somewhere that was fully accessible, entirely inclusive, and that actually promoted well-being amongst a wider demographic than the city worker that previously used the site. And I think it's almost useful to use Katie's kind of 7 criteria to reflect on this project, because it does provide a variety of different spaces, some for group activities like this amphitheatre in the middle, some areas for more intimate kind of reflection in closed spaces that also include an element of water that creates a kind of very different kind of audio or auditory experience than that of the busy railway below. And I think importantly, when it comes to inclusive design with this project, we sought to go beyond the minimum requirements for inclusive design. So for example, where you see the step going down to the amphitheatre, rather than your typical kind of tactile paving to denote that difference, here you have a change in both material and with that change of material, a different kind of auditory experience. So you both hear the difference and you feel the difference, as well as seeing the difference because of the colour contrast. So we sought to find different ways to achieve an environment that is more legible, more coherent to people with different kind of sensory appreciations. It also includes this mist feature, which again brings about a kind of a different sort of temporality to the site. So stimulation in kind of peaks and troughs rather than just being a consistent environment. And with such kind of features, it's increased the type and the nature of people who use the sites. And in doing so, it becomes more inclusive, more welcoming, and it signals that it is a space that genuinely is for everyone. And also, I mean, I guess the kind of the final point is that this is all sort of intersectional with the climate and biodiversity crisis. So in this site, I think one of the greatest achievements was we increased net biodiversity gain by 600%. That obviously helps create an environment that is cooler than just a hard landscape space. It offers different kind of sensory experiences, smell, sight, and touch. And it creates a kind of cleaner air environment next to what is otherwise a busy transport interchange. So thank you very much.
Thank you both. That was as interesting, definitely, and I think gives some really good insight into how to apply some of this new thinking. So thank you all. That's been really fascinating for me, I'm sure everybody. And we have a few questions which I think we'll pose now, and hopefully not risk running out of time. But I feel like I've really been educated on the subject extremely well. So firstly, from Stephen, I don't know who to put this to. Maybe you first, Katie. How do we persuade that inclusive design approach must be included in the project's budget, and who do we need to persuade? When public land is sold for development or public money is used, could and should its use be a term of the sale or of funding? I'm just wondering, you mentioned the PAS, is it, sorry, I wrote it down, I think 6463. I'm just wondering if that legislation needs to happen to actually make that compulsory.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. And I think, yeah, we need more things like that, and to sort of get people thinking about it seriously, really. I mean, it's just such a shame it's just not inclusive design needs to be spoken about, really, and it's just not what design is. So, but yeah, I think that hopefully will be a really important step towards getting people to think about it more seriously and recognize the benefits that it would have for the developments, to everyone, to everyone. And I think, yeah, it'd be really good to incorporate a budget within future projects. Yeah, sorry, I did see this question. I was a bit like, oh, how am I going to answer this? Yeah, and I was going to pass it on to you, Tom and Jane.
Well, I think that's a good time to pass it on. I mean, how do you handle that work in your projects? Obviously the amount of research you do, where does that budget sit and how do you accommodate it?
Well,
it's a tricky one.
Jane probably is going to give a better, more robust answer, but I think that it's something we constantly have to persuade people of the value of. Lots of the work we do try and, I guess, exploit the advantages of working often with developers who are kind of frequently, in our experience, more willing to diverge from standard public realm specifications that local authorities are perhaps slightly more have to adhere to, and that allows us to kind of test and then demonstrate the benefit of such things. I mean, with Exchange Square, commercial developers have worked out metrics to help demonstrate the value of public space or communal space to their surrounding office buildings. Still not, the value of that space being inclusive is perhaps not built into that. But Jane and I are actually just at the moment embarking on a bit of research that's funded by the RIBA that is looking at, I mean, the proposed outcome of this research is that we'll do an overlay for the RIBA plan of work that will demonstrate where and when within that life cycle project there are opportunities for co-design to take place. And I think our our position on this is that the more different user groups are brought into the process of design a project, the more inclusive design will be kind of embedded at a sort of foundational level. And I think, and that piece of research and that overlay is precisely in order to give designers a sort of, you know, a framework for saying to their clients and saying to local authorities, look, this is, you know, this stage should be better funded. There should be better fees associated with it. There should be more money available for co-design. It may be called RIBA stage 0, but actually, you know, there's this huge amount of work that you need to do in order to reap the kind of the benefits in terms of social justice further down the line.
Yeah.
It's also, well, in our experience with the sort of different officers from local authorities, it felt that a lot of local authorities want to invest in such work, and it was actually, the difficulty for them is the same. It's like proving the value of doing such work. So I think with the emergence of the past and also this guidelines that we just did, sort of, you know, pushing for more consultation and sort of front loading the co-design part would hopefully be the recommendation that they can use to take on when they take on new work. It just also, something that came to mind is some authorities are creating their own accessibility tools. So say City of London, they've created a accessibility tool for public space. So I think some of those might actually go back to influence design, because obviously if you have a tool for the back end, it will inform how you actually do things from the beginning. We'll see more of those emerging.
It's changing, I guess. Yeah, no, thank you. David, I'm not missing your question out. I'm going to skip to Oliver's. Hello, Oliver, just because I think it leads on from this conversation a little better. And this was posed again to you, Katie, but I think it's everyone's. Is there a danger in designing spaces that have longevity of use? Oh, it's moved, sorry, around specific neurodivergent sensory profiles? Or should we just accept that diversity exists and take a more general design approach? I guess that comes into the conversations we've just had about intersectionality and universal design and how hard it is to find one size that fits all in every aspect of inclusivity. So maybe you all have a thought on that.
Yeah, and I think what has been spoken about a lot today is, it's so impossible to create one thing for all. So that's why it feels like, particularly in your work as well, Jane and Tom, it's about creating lots of choices and thinking about, creating different spaces within a space. From my own experience, that's all I can talk about really. I think there's real benefit in my case, designing, I've designed with autistic people with learning disabilities, and I feel that some of the sort of things that have come about from that could really be useful to everyone. So I think there's real benefit into it. I take the feeling that if you were to sort of go about design generally, there could be lots of people that might be excluded from that design, but actually by thinking about people who may have a bit more of a different experience of things, by starting to explore how they experience the environment, what their needs are, then that outcome or thing could be or would be useful to everyone. So that's sort of my thoughts around this question.
And I think that's the role of a really talented designer, isn't it, to take all of those inputs with the brief and somehow develop something that hopefully is suitable for almost all. That's the best you can probably hope for. It's difficult. Choices
within that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Did you have any points to make on that, Jane or Tom?
I think we certainly agree. I think it's the variety that I think is important to create kind of different places that appeal to different people. And I think baking that into a project minimizes the risk that those things will, attitudes might change or things become redundant, because that variety will always be useful, I would suggest. The other thing we always consider, and I think this also, I mean, Katie spoke really well about the idea of the importance of the process, the design process, rather than, let's say, the kind of the product at the end of it. And I think that that's something that we're trying to build into our work. We have this kind of like saying that, you know, our project's never finished, you know, continue to evolve. And I think building in the scope for them to continue to evolve is really important. So for us, the project is never designed, you know, here you go, bam, done. There's always the anticipation and the means for it to you know, change and adapt to allow it to be kind of, you know, future understanding of requirements.
I think that's tricky. I mean, it's also funding that sort of monitor and review stage, isn't it? Which is so crucial, but who pays for that as well? You know, going back to Stephen's original question. I better keep these moving on. David has a question again, Katie, for you. Are there any lessons we could apply to the design of the wider neighbourhood and city beyond the home? I guess, Jane, Tom, you've addressed some of that. Maybe already.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were speaking, you've been addressing that question, but I think, you know, there are definitely like different things to consider once you leave the home, because the home is so like familiar and potentially quite predictable. And so the minute you leave the home, it's just got lots of other different things, you know, unpredictability, unfamiliar people, unfamiliar environments. And I think a lot of it, from my experience, is it then goes into the realm of really trying to it's all about understanding and empathy, like trying to educate people about, in my case, autism, trying to understand it, to empathize, so that, you know, if you've got a child and you're going to a cafe and it's a bit too loud, you've got the confidence and the cafe owners are understanding that you need that music to come down or off, essentially, or there is a space that you can go in that cafe that's quieter because they've made that space available. So yeah, that's kind of my communication as well, particularly needs to be really clear. But I think there's lots of things I've learned within the home that definitely can be applied externally, but I think yeah, understanding and empathy is really key once you leave the home, potentially. But maybe I just thought Mike's question, maybe Mike would have more of an understanding around that than I would as well.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I mean, you can all read Mike's questions. Morning, Mike. As a father of a son who's severely autistic and nonverbal, found Katie's work really very interesting. I'll be interested in reports. I'm sure you can catch up after this today.
I just wanted to apologize now, Mike, because I know you sent me a message on LinkedIn, and I'm really not very active on social media, including LinkedIn, but I was planning on getting back to you. So yeah, definitely like to be in touch.
But then also says you recently led a small public realm project and co-designed with many disability and cognitive diversity groups who are all delighted and insightful to contribute. I'm sure that's so rare, just inviting, you know, everybody to contribute. So yeah, that's great to know. And I guess, you know, amongst all of these other points, we need more of that. It's quite simple in many ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
And like we were saying already, you know, providing choice and flexibility in every project for everyone. There was another one, just a comment really from Aileen before, which I thought was really interesting, and you saw, Katie. It just goes to show that we need these important green spaces that not only benefit the planet, biodiversity, net gain, etc., but are also really important from a sensory and well-being perspective. And a comment on that, such important work and research. Landscape-led schemes are the way forward for sure. I think every landscape architect listening will be applauding that one. But I think that's also the point of us framing these conversations around the United Nations SDGs, you know, that there's no one area. I think we talk a lot about being green, being environmentally sound, but actually none of it matters if you don't incorporate all three pillars of sustainability and the social aspect, and people are key to this as much as anything else. So it is really important work and research.
I've got a question actually for Tom and Jane, because I think you mentioned you're fairly new to working in the space of neurodivergence. So I just wanted to just hear a little bit about how your experience of it and what you've learned as designers, architects, how it sort of enriched your practice potentially. Because I know as a designer, having worked with autistic people, I mean, I'm just blown away by how creative and how I think autistic people can really contribute towards innovation, and they should be leading design essentially. Obviously not everyone, but you know, some of the people I'm working with. So just interested to know if you've, you know, what you've learned, or what's been stood out to you, or what's been different even.
Well, part of it sort of goes projective and retrospective, as Tom sort of framed it at the beginning. That part of it is sort of realizing that actually maybe a lot of the work that we are doing is informed by this earlier work that we did for designing schools for special needs. But then the sort of the more current sort of activities that we're doing, we're speaking a lot to experts in this field. So Jean Howitt, who is I think the main author of the PASS document, based in Bureau Happold. So we came into contact with her because of this Highways and Footways accessibility guidance. And actually in the process, I think what was most unexpected for designers in the studio is self-knowledge, that after a session with her, I think some of us actually realized that neurodiversity or neurodivergence explains some of their behaviors or some of their sensitivities. And so, like you said, Katie, earlier, that it's sort of empowering you as the designer with that knowledge to either, you know, be able to confront something or to sort of identify what that is, and, you know, verbalizing the need for certain things. So that was a really valuable experience. But then we also see how much it intersects with, again, the co-design process, that you could only address it by either consulting or designing with the people that you're designing for. So a large part of the sort of, I guess the intersectional part just made us realize how relevant both of the issues are to each other. And then I guess also in teaching, in your teaching work at the RCA, there are also sort of increasing desire in students in addressing such issues. And then actually there are quite novel projects that came out of that, that sort of work with designing methodologies rather than just the sort of formal project.
It's been great. I've definitely seen an increase in Royal College of Art students wanting to work with in the space of neurodivergence, for sure, which is great.
Thank you. I'm just aware that we've only got a few minutes left. I didn't want to sort of shunt this along, but I think we need to probably draw things to a close fairly soon. But thank you, just to try and finish on time. I hope you found today helpful, and what we've talked about has been aligned with your expectations from SDG 10, and hopefully everybody feels we can make more positive changes now that we're more aware of these everyday inequalities. That's the intent of this Fika series at its heart. Please do follow us for more information. If you haven't already signed up to our newsletter, please do, and you will find out about future Fikas, and we can keep in touch with you. We talk a lot about using design as a tool for change, anti-hostile design, inclusive public spaces, all of those subjects. So do sign up with us on our About Us page, and or follow us on social media. Not you, Katie, we won't force you to start using it. It's not for everyone. That's fine. And just to summarise, thank you for giving up an hour to join us. There are so many opportunities now for these sorts of webinars and for your time competing against everyone else. So we've reduced our Fikas to quarterly now instead of monthly. We have one coming up in September, which we're hoping will be live from our new factory, which is now pretty much fully operational in Norway, the Plus. And then another one in December, which we're just putting together, but we hope will be on biodiversity net gain in action. And if you're suffering from withdrawal, they're all available on Catch Up at that link. And don't forget they count towards your CPD, and many, not this one today particularly, but many of them contribute to the climate emergencies demand from the Landscape Institute for 5 hours each year. And obviously we also have our formal CPDs if you'd like more. And do bear in mind our competition and prize to go and see the Plus. We've relaunched it for next year. So speakers, all of you joining us will be put into a draw on that December webinar, and we'll pull out a name of somebody to take next year. So please do join us. You know, every chance gives you another little bit more of a foot up that ladder. So thank you all again, and particularly obviously Katie, Jane and Tom for sharing your amazing insight into this area. Hopefully the conversation will continue. If anybody does want contacts, please just let me know and I can pass you on and put you in touch. I think there may well be a bit of that following this, I'm sure, because it's such a new and highly relevant area. And I think all it remains for me to do is say enjoy the rest of your week. Normally I'd be wishing you a good weekend, but we've changed it this month, so it's a bit strange, but yeah, worked out really well. So thank you all again, and